We are back again here in the garage. It's winter, so it's freezing. I got some heaters going. Luckily I insulated this shop the past fall, so it's been really awesome to work in here in the winter. And we're working on another Jeep project. This is a 1994 Jeep Cherokee 4.0 engine, AW4 automatic transmission. We got a bit of work to do on this one. The only thing that I've done so far is put a door handle on it. It did not have a door handle when I got it. And today we're gonna be doing a couple things just because I don't feel like getting too into it and it's snowing outside, so I don't want to go outside of my parts Jeep to grab some other stuff. So today we're doing a radio. In this video will be focused on just working or installing a new radio. This video really will apply to any vehicle. It's not going to be Jeep Cherokee specific. I'll show you all the wires and everything on this one, but you can apply the same concepts that you're going to learn in today's video to installing an aftermarket radio in really any vehicle. So first step is going to be to unplug or disconnect your battery. I'll take you off the tripod to show you that, but really the rest of this video I'm going to try to stay on tripod just so it's not so wobbly. So we come over here, battery, you can see it's already disconnected, pretty straightforward. I just removed the positive terminal. It doesn't matter, positive or negative. My positive just had more slack. Action. Oh, this thing needs to be cleaned a little bit. Plus, check out this steering wheel. And I know what you're thinking. It's not, the column itself is not broken or loosened up like a lot of them are. This one's actually, all the bearings fell out. So I got a new steering column for my parts Jeep that I'll show you how to swap in. That's neither here nor there. Back to business, the radio. So the first step is going to be to get access to your radio. If you've got a stock radio, you're probably going to have to remove a lot of these trim pieces to pull it out. In my case, there was an aftermarket one in here at some point. I can tell by this sweet mess of wiring going on here. Now, the other deal there is I already have access to it. All the wires came like this, hanging, dangling out. Otherwise, you would typically have to maybe pull off this plastic cover, this fake artificial wood grain thing, and that's really easy to do. In my case, I don't have to. Sometimes you got to use those little shims to pull the radio out that's already in there, and you'll get access to the wiring. At this point, the wires have already been disconnected from the actual radio. Here is another junk radio. This is, oh, this might have been the one that was in it. No, the electrical, oh yeah, it does. Electrical does line up. So the electrical, you could just disconnect it from the back of the radio and then put your actual unit somewhere else. That don't work. And then you're basically gonna have one of two options. If you are stock, if you've never had a different radio put in there before, what you're gonna have is just this plug coming from your engine harness. It's all the way down in there. You know, I should probably take you off the tripod so you can see this a little bit better. I was trying to get you guys some good angles on the tripod so you don't have to deal with the shaky hand, but too bad. No good angles. So this is a better shot. If you just have a stock radio, you're not going to have this ground wire spliced in. All you're going to have is basically this wiring harness that plugs into the back of your radio. If somebody else has already spliced in an aftermarket one, hopefully they've done it the correct way, or the more cleaner way to do it, the less invasive way, where you go and buy one of these additional harnesses from like Radio Shack or Best Buy or probably Amazon at this point. And what this does is it plugs into your factory wiring harness, and then it gives you a bunch of new wires that you can cut and splice your radio wiring harness into, instead of having to hack up your stock wiring harness and splice into these wires. A lot of times that's just what you're going to be left with, and it's not that big of a deal. It just depends on how clean you want to do it. So in our case, this black is a ground wire. It's, for whatever reason, it's not included in this factory harness. It's off to the side, and that's why it's spliced in like this. No big deal. What we're gonna do to actually save ourselves a lot of trouble is we're just gonna undo all these twist ties. This is really not the way you should install automotive radios. This is like what you'd find inside of a house. They use these twist connections for lights a lot. I mean, I guess they work, but not very secure. all the bouncing that happens in cars, these will probably fall off. So I'm just gonna untwist all of these, and then I should be able to separate all of my wires. And then what I'm gonna do is take off the old radio wiring harness. I am going to take my connecting piece and I'm gonna figure out what these connections ran to, and then I'll write them down for this, and then I'm gonna go wire this up inside so I don't have to sit in the cold, and I'll have better lighting for you guys. Now, the other piece that you need to figure out is you're gonna need to go online and research what every single color on your factory wiring harness means. It's very straightforward. If you just type in the year, make, model, and then you put in stereo wiring diagram, you're gonna find a number of websites that'll show you exactly what color means what. So typically on these, pink I think is gonna be your 12 volt constant for these Cherokees. Orange might be your 12 volt battery. And then all these different blue and white, gray and yellow, green and pink, those colors are gonna be your different speaker wires. They're gonna be positive and negative, and they're gonna tie into your wiring harness for your radio. And I'll show you what all that looks like when we get inside and how to tie it together, and then the correct way to solder and connect these and heat shrink these connections. Okay, so I got the old radio harness taken off. Now the first step for me before I go inside is I just temporarily reattached this connector, this adapter, and I'm gonna follow and trace all these pins and make myself a diagram to go inside so that I know the factory harness, we have brown and yellow, and that is gonna lead to solid green on my adapter. So that way when I look up the colors and the diagram for the factory harness and then my radio, I know exactly, I basically know that brown and yellow eventually turns into solid green. So when I'm trying to wire up something to the brown and yellow wire, I know I need to hit the green based on my cheat sheet that I make before I head inside. All right, we're inside and I've got things opened up. The next step for me is I just went to the12volt.com. You can kind of see a chart there. It's not very focused, but it's basically going to run you all of the type of wire it is. So on this one side it's going to say constant 12 volt, switch 12 volt, that's your ignition. There's ground, illumination, dimmer, antenna trigger, front left, positive, front right, negative, all that stuff going down here. And then the color that it is coming from the factory. So this is what's going to tell me what's coming out of my wiring harness for the car. And then you just need to get your wiring diagram for your radio. And in this case it's printed on the back of the radio. So it's, I don't know if you guys can see that or not, but basically over here I've got, there's two different plugs, but I've got a white and black, and that's the front left positive and front left negative for that speaker. On a different one I've got the ignition is red, so on this wiring harness I've got a red wire. That is my switched ignition. And then I've got a black for ground, and then I've got yellow, which would be the 12 volt constant, and then the antenna is blue, which I'm not going to be using. But basically, so what you're going to do is then go back to your chart here online. You've got one that says, let's focus you back up. Then it's got constant 12 volt is pink. So I know coming out of my car I have a pink wire, and that needs to go to the constant 12 volt on this radio, which is yellow. When you take these little guys off, you got your actual wires for soldering. But I know coming out of the car should be a pink wire. So then I go to the little chart that I wrote on the back of this, and I've got a pink wire that attaches and turns into a yellow wire on this little adapter. So I know this big yellow wire right here, this is my constant 12 volt source. So this yellow needs to go to this yellow. And then I'll solder these bad boys together, and then I'll move down to the next one. So that's how I'm doing it. I'm actually not going to be soldering. I'm going to try out these cool little things I found on Amazon. They seem pretty nifty. I'll grab a big one so maybe you can see better, but this is kind of what it is. Apparently you just feed the wire in each side, and then I think you heat it up, and this metal bead right here solders the two together, and then these things heat shrink down, and it creates a pretty good connection without having to crimp or really doing traditional soldering, which I've done in the past. It's kind of a pain. So I'm gonna try these guys out, see how they work. I'll put all this together right now, and then by YouTube magic, we should be ready to go. Alright, so everything's coming together pretty well here. These little clips from China are pretty sweet. Don't have to crimp anything, and they're soldered together now and heat shrink. So that's awesome. One thing that I kind of forgot, I haven't worked with one of these adapters in a long time, is a lot of them actually say on the wire what it's for. So they are vehicle specific, and it plugs right into the factory harness. So they do know what wires these are for. So I know you're not going to be able to see it, but you know, if you look at the wire, and these are pretty dirty, on the yellow one it's got 12 volt memory, battery / memory written on it, and that just means you're constant. The red one says 12 volt ignition. This white one with a black stripe says left front speaker, and then negative in parentheses. Typically your ground is always going to be a black wire, and then your negatives on these speakers are going to have like a black stripe through it, and that's the case with all of these guys. And that's a lot of times with your radios as well. So for example, my right front positive is gray, my right front negative is gray with a black stripe, and that's actually the same thing on this radio harness. Right front positive is gray, right front negative is gray with a black stripe. Now the colors may not always match up with it being gray to gray, but it typically is the one with the black stripe through it is going to be your ground. So I'll let you see one of these bad boys live. Now that I said that, I'm sure it won't go very smoothly, but I'm just twisting. I already slipped on that that neat little wire connector and heat shrink deal. I already slipped it over, and now I'm just going to slide it back over my twisted together wires and line up the, I don't know, piece in the middle. It's got the little metal band, and then I'm just using, instead of a heat gun, I'm using a little mini torch, a butane torch, and then I'm just rotating as I go like a little rotisserie chicken. And you'll watch the heat shrink kind of melt and shrink down. Don't go too long in one area, otherwise you'll start to burn and singe your sheathing on the wire. And then once you hit the middle for long enough, you see the solder melt and start to flow into the wires, and that's when you know you're done. Pretty good deal. So I'll finish up the rest of these. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and give it a shot. I'm gonna connect up the battery. Now that steering column in the ignition is kind of broken, but should be in the off position now. The wires should be hooked up. Okay, we've got battery connected. Still off, so that's good for now. Let's go ahead and we should have seen something come on. Now the buzzer on this thing is always on as well. Alright, I did have some trouble with some of the wiring on the backside, but nothing that would affect it not coming on at all. So, I guess now what we've got to do is get out our multimeter and start back probing some of these things and making sure we've got a good ground, making sure we've got a 12 volt constant coming to the actual radio, make sure our fuses aren't blown. So that's what we'll do next. So what did we figure out? Well, I got out the multimeter and went through my diagnostics. I didn't find any blown fuses down there. The radio fuse was fine. The ground was fine. I found out that I did have the 12 volt constant, my yellow wire or the pink coming from the harness. That all checked out. That was 12 volts when the car was off when it was supposed to be. but when I went into ignition, my ignition wire was not sending a 12 volt source to the radio. So that's why the radio is not coming on. And there's a couple things here. So I checked it all the way back to the harness. There's no 12 volts coming straight from the harness, so it's obviously not making it to the radio. It means my wiring connections are probably fine, but I did chase that. It's a purple and white wire, and it goes all the way down to the steering column. Because what my first assumption is, this steering column like I showed you before, it's all messed up, and the tumbler inside this ignition right here where you put the key in, that is really messed up as well. It rarely ever wants to actually twist. You kind of got to force it, and it's hard to get the key in and out, and hard to twist it backwards. So I suspect, and it doesn't feel normal, like it doesn't feel like it's got your normal on for radio and then start and then go back to ignition and then down for just radio and the car's off. It doesn't feel like it has the normal function, so I think something within this ignition is likely broken, and I suspect that's why I'm not getting 12 volts to my radio. Okay, so I don't know where the camera cut off, but basically we'll try to splice this in. I got 12 volt constant. I am not getting my ignition 12 volt. This steering column is real messed up, and the lock cylinder in here, the key cylinder, the ignition, this feels really messed up as well. So before I go more troubleshooting with the radio, I'm swapping this column out to my donor truck anyways, and I have a feeling that's gonna then get me power at my radio where it should be. Otherwise, all I've got to do to remedy this is just run a jumper wire basically from my ignition terminal on the radio behind the dash and down into the fuse box, and that's really straightforward. You could put a fuse in there if you want. I'll show you how to do that if that ends up being the case. But other than that, the only thing left you've got to do is figure out your mounting position within this little cubby hole, and that's straightforward. You can see somebody has already chewed up the inside of this bezel, and that's okay. You'll do it with a Dremel or a knife, and then you're gonna get that little tin DIN, this thing that the radio sits in, and it's got all these tabs, these triangles. So you take the radio out basically, and then you set the tin inside that hole there, and then you pry up all these tabs on the back side of this dash piece, and that'll hold the tin in this hole, and then you just press your radio in. And that mounts everything up. The antenna obviously plugs right in like I've got it. But that's basically how to put a radio in. Unfortunately, it's not really the best video right now. I'll try to make a closing one once I get it actually working and show you what I did. But in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to a different project for now, and then I'll swap this steering column out at a later day. I'll make a video on that as well. So thanks for watching. Okay, I got the new column switched in here, and let's hit the radio. We'll go. Now the buzzer works with the new column, and the radio comes on. Awesome. And there's our static.
It was a tremendous curveball for Oklahoma. It is a completely...
So, Jesus Radio. Awesome. Stereo works with the new column. And that's the radio. Everything's mounted up.
Tribal nations in Oklahoma and beyond argued...
Yeah. There you go.